Hey, this is Brad Block, host of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. Doctors change lives every day. But what happens when life changes yours? A single injury, a sudden illness, your career, your income, your future can shift in an instant. The best physicians don't just plan for success, they protect it. At Set for Life Insurance, they believe financial security isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. True own occupation disability insurance ensures that no matter what happens, your future stays in your hands. Because protecting your income means protecting everything you've built. Visit drpodcastnetwork.co/setforlife today. Secure your future before life makes that choice for you. Welcome back to the podcast. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about communication best practices. And for this, we have Dr. Todd Wolynn. He is a pediatrician and the executive director of the Trusted Messenger program, which is a part of the Public Good Projects. His work focuses on educating healthcare providers to utilize communicating best practices to help people reach personal evidence-based health decisions. So to help you better help your patients, which is what we're all about here on the show. Dr. Wolynn, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I am fanboying a little bit because I've been a big fan of yours since Shots Heard Around the World. We might end up talking about that today, but thanks so much for being on the show.
It's completely my honor. I'm thrilled, and thanks for having me on.
So let's get down to it. Can you share a specific instance where effective communication changed a patient's perspective? And the way I wrote the question was on vaccination, but it doesn't need to be that. Where you found that, listen, the nuance of being a good communicator and the skills that you've learned work to steer the conversation.
I would say that, yes, I can point out examples that include things like vaccination, but it could include things like anything from like car seat installation or some sleep advice. I did sleep medicine for multiple years as well. So it's trying to help people get to, as we said, a personal health decision that's hopefully evidence-based. The big problem is that you and I, and pretty much anybody out there listening, as healthcare professionals, we weren't trained in communication. So I know that one of the places I really started doing a lot of training was like HPV vaccination. HPV vaccination was relatively new. The trouble for most pediatricians on recommending HPV vaccinations was they never saw HPV disease, right? That's one of the weird ones. Think about it. Yeah. Most of the vaccines that pediatricians recommend, they typically throughout residency may have seen cases of Haemophilus influenza B or pneumococcal disease or meningitis or rotavirus, or now RSVs available. But HPV is a funny one in that you're recommending something that you almost certainly did not see the bad outcome unless it was the recurrent papillomatosis.
Recurrent respiratory papillomatosis, which we, as otolaryngologists, right, we see a lot of, or at least I saw a lot of it in residency. I haven't seen it since.
But that was a neat one, right? Yeah. Think about that, which was, I will completely remember that I was sitting on an advisory board in 2017, 11 years after the vaccine came out. The National Immunization Survey data only showed 37% of girls were up to date. Here's a freaking vaccine that stops cancer. The whole reason women get pap smears is to pick up precancers, hopefully, early enough that they don't have to have too much done in the form of chemo or radiation or surgical removal, or hopefully just, if it has to be anything, maybe just a small portion of their cervix being removed. God, who wants to go through that? So here we have something that stops precancers and deaths. And we're seeing that data right now. Like, we're seeing the rates of all those dropping through the floor in countries where rates are good. And even though in the US the rates are okay, we're seeing that data showing that it's dropping. But I remember seeing how making a recommendation can make a difference. So much so that I ended up doing work with the CDC in talking about how to recommend it. And here's something really interesting. People used to say, because they said, oh, I don't know, it's new, right? It was 10 years out at that point. And they would say, today, Joey's here and needs his TDAP and his meningitis, because those usually school required. And then there's this HPV too.
Yeah.
Think about the change in your cadence of your voice.
Yeah.
And the confidence with which you're making that recommendation. Joey needs TDAP and meningitis. And there's this other one, like the natural instincts. I'll take the two you sounded more certain about, but that third one, I don't know, which is when CDC started coming out and saying, look, the way to make this recommendation, take HPV and sandwich it in the middle. You understand now, you've seen the data, you understand why an anti-cancer vaccine is pretty potent, but you're making the recommendation in a not particularly strong way. And so they said you could sandwich it. So today, Joey needs his TDAP, his HPV, and his meningitis.
When you say needs, right? So those other ones, they need them for school, but you don't need HPV for school.
You need it to prevent cancers, though.
Got it.
So for the female in that scenario, we're talking about a huge source of cervical cancer, also vulvar and vaginal cancers. And for the guy, penile cancers are definitely caused by HPV. There's some other causes, anal cancer.
Anal, but no.
Yeah.
Otolaryngologist. Yeah, I just diagnosed it the other day. Tonsil cancer in someone who had their tonsils out. So there's a little remnant of tonsil tissue that sometimes happens, and that had, or it came up from the base of tongue, because that might have started the base of tongue, kind of crawled up. That would be the other situation. So we see that. And actually, sometimes this is something I learned from social media, because it's not all bad. There's good, and this is you're a great example of that. Now, so I'll have these young men in my office, and they might have gone previously to the pediatrician with a parent who wasn't super into vaccines. Now I have them. They're like either late teens, early 20s. And I'm like, by the way, do you know if you got your HPV vaccine? I was like, because I just diagnosed someone with throat cancer. I don't want to see you in 20 or 30 years with that same throat cancer. Oh, and by the way, it'll prevent you from getting warts on your dick.
That's the thing that motivates teenagers is junk on their junk.
Yes, exactly. And that's the bit at the end, right? The warts on your dick is what I learned from social media, because they're not worried about 50-year-old them.
First rule of communication, know your audience. And so the thing that motivates, particularly, as you said, young adults, is the fact that how do you explain that when you're intimate with somebody? And so it's a real deal for sure, to your point. And perfect example of another good communication best practice is know your audience and know what motivates them.
Speaking of communication best practices, what is the Trusted Messenger program? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I'm going to say that I'm in a really cool place after 30 years in my own pediatric practice and going up through the route of finally becoming the CEO and getting to run an amazing practice, which was Kids Plus Pediatrics. It was 3 offices, 100 employees, 20 providers. As of the end of December, I just left that practice and joined a nonprofit, Public Good Projects, which I've known now for 4 years, and was telling them I was leaving my practice. They knew about my passion for communication because I've been volunteering there as an advisor for 4 years. They said, how about running our Trusted Messenger program? And as you said in the intro, the whole point of the Trusted Messenger program is that we focus on working with healthcare providers to use communication best practices to drive quality outcomes. Whatever those outcomes are, maybe it's vaccination rates, but maybe it's car seat installation, or maybe it's pap smears, or maybe it's mental health screenings. The key here is that we as healthcare providers, and when I say healthcare providers, by the way, not just docs, NPs, and PAs, we're talking about dentists, we're talking about pharmacists, we're talking about mental health workers, we're talking about community health workers, public health workers, and public health professionals. All of us have an amazing asset, which we squander daily, which is trust. And while professions year upon year, as they're ranked, are all sliding a little in terms of trust, at the top of that list are healthcare providers. Number one, nurses, docs, pharmacists, PAs, NPs, we're all near the top too. Pediatricians are closest to nurses, just to throw that in.
So let's talk about that trust, right? Because I feel like that one-to-one conversation with a patient, right? They come, in some situations they've chosen you, in some situations they've ended up with you, right? Sometimes the trust is yours to lose. Like, they come in because they want your help, right? Whether they chose you or did, they want your help. And to start with the negative here, what are some things that we can do to lose trust so we can make sure we don't do that?
Okay, so as you just pointed out, they trust you enough to be walking in either with their own personal health, which is a pretty vulnerable thing, right? So they're there just by just being in your exam room, or in pediatrics, their most prized thing in the world, their kid. How can we lose that trust? The data shows, at least from a physician standpoint, we interrupt our patients typically within about 23 seconds. That's a good way to show that you're not really into listening to what they have to say. But think about our healthcare system. And look, you and I talked a little bit right before we got started about physicians find themselves in different settings. They can be in large academic centers. They can be in primary care. They can be in specialists. They can be in large owned systems. But there's this general push for productivity. I got to get to the next patient. I got to get to the next patient. Because there's still an element of, even though we're shifting away for fee for service, the more I do, the more I'll get paid. The more patients I see, the more I can get through, the more I'll get paid, or the more I can see patients so I don't get too backed up. But that productivity comes at the expense of a rush. And most patients will tell you that for the most part, they tend to feel rushed. They tend to feel not heard by their own healthcare providers. It's really frustrating. It's an intimidating situation for many people because there's a hierarchy of the healthcare providers on high, I'm just the patient. But there is this move, particularly in younger generations, of, hey, I have something to tell you. I would tell you healthcare providers, particularly of the older vintages and me and older, kind of were trained of, you're going to say things and patients are going to do that. That's kind of bullshit. We may have been trained that way, but I remember when data started coming out on prescription fill rates, and you write for all this and you're like, oh, everybody fills what I say.
Yeah.
And it'd be like 50%. Now, some of it may have been of cost. Some of it may have been on they don't believe you, but gone are the days, and this is a real old boomer reference, of Marcus Welby, where you say something and the 1950s doctor is completely listened to. We can't take that for granted. We have to be able to display active listening. There's different methodologies in communication, but we have to communicate powerfully, which means listening and having a dialogue.
Okay, so not feeling rushed, making sure they don't feel rushed. So one of those things that we're all told is make sure you sit down. And yes, definitely, it's powerful to sit down, and there's a really high return on investment. What are some other ways, other cues that you can give to make them feel like they're not being rushed, even though in your head, you're well aware that there are 5 people in the waiting room getting more and more frustrated with you?
So I would say, going back to active listening, to take time to mirror people's words back to.
Yeah.
To make sure that you're getting it right. So I just want to make sure, stopping occasionally, particularly when you're getting to what you believe is the meat of that diagnosis. My senior partner always said, history gives you like 80% of the diagnosis, at least in primary care. And taking time to pause to say, did I get that right? And repeating some of the words is a pretty powerful thing to do. The other thing that I'm going to say, and it, being that it's 2025, is that healthcare as a sector, and we're the largest sector of the US economy, right? We use digital like we're complete idiots. And the reason why I'm bringing up digital, and you might say, I was just talking about talking to a person in the office, is you can't scale up talking to a person in the office. We can talk about best practices, about how to maximize the communication exchange while you're face-to-face. It still isn't going to address everything that patient has on their mind. And so at 2 a.m, when they're in the bathroom, they're going to have another question. And would it be cool if they could still hear what you have to say at 2 a.m. by being able to find some representation of you answering a question they have? And people might say, oh my God, how do you do that? We're just a 3-doc practice or whatever. And I would say we did it. Kids Plus Pediatrics did it. We had a communications director. We had a studio, but now I say, if you have a smartphone and a teenager, you could do anything we did in that studio or do in that studio. But what we ended up doing on our website was going after every question that we were asked that was relatively common and providing answers for it. First, we did it in just long form prose, just writing answers out to it, always polished it up through our communications director. Eventually, we'd start shooting small videos on that, inserting it into those text-based articles. But the key here is that, yes, there are powerful things you can do in terms of communication face-to-face, and you should be trained in being a better communicator face-to-face. Just recognize, though, it's not just Gen Z that wants their information when they want it, how they want it, and where they want it. It is
everyone with a phone, everyone with a smartphone that knows how to type on it. Yeah.
And the key is they're going to ask those questions. And if you're not there in some form or capacity to answer it, somebody else will. And they may have no medical expertise. And they may not have at all the best interest of that patient.
So actually, there's a great way to leverage that into more efficient visits as well. So I think a year or so ago, I had someone on the show. His name is David Keynes. He's a urologist. And he's got a company called Well Prepped. And what they do, I have no stake in the company, but he's a great guy and he's got a great product. So he's a urologist who does a lot of cancer surgery. And so what he started doing was sending people, because they'd come to him already having a diagnosis. So he would say, this is the stuff that I want you to learn before you come and see me so we can have a more fruitful and thoughtful conversation. We can be more nuanced to it. You end up not just saying the same things over and over. It makes it more fulfilling for the patient and for the doctor. But you can do that, to your point, on your social media presence. We say the same things over and over. So you just say them online. And if a patient's coming in, like a parent's coming in with questions about kids' sleep, you queue up your YouTube video. You say, listen, the doctor's going to be here in 5 minutes. Why don't you watch this first? She'll be right in. And then they can watch the video. And then their questions might be a little more nuanced and they might have fewer of them because then you answer. So there's like other ways that you can leverage this, not just to answer their questions asynchronously, to make your visits more efficient.
And again, somebody who works a lot with communications, sometimes you need to hear the information more than one time. So the opportunity to listen to something pre-recorded, as you said, allows you to now ask a more nuanced question than having heard it for the first time. And what do most patients say? Oh my God, I wish I was taking notes. They said something, I remember it. Now they have the video. Yeah. Then you said it in person. They can go back and watch the video again. So 100%, I love that example. And that's very much what we did. And we would also reference when we were seeing our patients in the waiting room, we would pull up our page and our videos, whether you wanted to watch it on YouTube, Vimeo, Facebook, and say, hey, here. And we would even give them links through the portal. Here's the video so they could get reinforced information with that. Or our staff learned if they were calling in ahead of time to do exactly what the urologist said. Here's 2 videos. Why don't you check these out? It may allow you to ask a different question that you might not have asked now that you've already gotten some exchange of information prior to the visit.
And if you've been in practice for a couple of years, you can give that talk in your sleep because you've said it so many times. So just pick up your phone. And I'm such a hypocrite for saying this because it's been on my list of things to do since I spoke to Dr. Cairns a year ago, and I still haven't done it. And it's so simple. You have that information. You have that talk because you've said it so many times.
Our communications director said, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on Facebook because he literally had answered at that point like 5,000 questions. Because what he would do is a question would come in through the portal or through the website, and he would just send it out to the 20 of us because there are 20 providers. And usually somebody who liked that subject would be the one to answer it. But then he would edit it just for communication excellence. Yeah. And before you knew it, our voice of our practice had a singular voice, even though it had everybody's different personality. And then he became so good. And as the questions came in, it's only the 17th time I've seen this. So he could send that answer out already pre-written or pre-prepared.
So we're talking about trust earlier. I want to get back to that because we have an increasingly skeptical patient population. And so how do we continue to build trust in light of that, right? Like it's the death of expertise. As much as healthcare practitioners are trusted, to your point about Marcus Welby, it's just not what it used to be.
Right. I would say a lot of that is based on how we've allowed things to progress within our own healthcare system. Again, the focus on productivity and the complete absence of communication training and essentially abdicating the role of social media, right? Healthcare is the largest sector of the U.S. economy. And yet every other sector, hospitality, retail, shipping, they all use digital to change behavior. They all use digital to change behavior. I'm Starbucks. I can give you nudges and messages and get you to buy my $12 double pump mocha latte. And I'm Disney. I can give you a few cool videos and a few prompts, and you're looking at my cruise line now, right? And yet here we are, Brad. We're trying to help promote health or promote recovery from an illness. We're not selling tires. We're not selling insurance. We're not selling cruises. We're not selling coffee. We are literally trying to help people get to their own personal decision that we hope ends up being evidence-based. And yet we don't. As a matter of fact, not only don't we, most people, when they join their practices or their institutions, sign a contract that literally says, don't get us in trouble using digital or social media. So you're not only not supported or trained, you're semi-threatened. And so here again, we squander the trust because we remain silent. And as you and I know, not only is there trust, there's the just general kind of belief of what somebody says from a healthcare standpoint. So how many people do we see out there throwing on their lab coat or their stethoscope and saying complete nonsense and getting a gajillion hits, particularly when they're saying something that's divisive or sensational? And algorithms are not scrubbing for authenticity. And as it continues, we're seeing less of that. It typically is things that are sensational, scary, threatening, divisive, right? We saw those reports come out with several different studies and looks into what drives algorithms. So you could say today, this new medication came out and people got it, and 1 million people got it, and everybody did pretty good. And there was like an 80% effectiveness rate. It was great. Boop. But all you have to do is say, oh, this company is in some nefarious relationship with this other company, and they're putting in nanoparticles and snake venom. Yeah. and it's going to turn you into a zombie.
Here's what your doctor doesn't want you to know. Here's what Big Pharma doesn't want you to know. Here's what they're not taught in medical school.
Yeah. And then it blows up.
Actually, I've seen Dr. Varshavsky, I think is his last name. He'll put those clickbaity type of things, but then you follow it, and he's got tons of good information out there. It's funny how he's leveraging that, which seems like it's going to lean to clickbaity, but man, I've seen him rake some people over the coals about their spread of misinformation. So kudos to him for being.
If you follow social media best practices, it's all about the first 2 seconds, right? It's really about the hook. So leading with that sensation, let me tell you something that everybody's trying to keep a secret. Right? Tell me more. And then if he goes in and dispels it, that's great. But there's a reason you need to place the hook out there, because if you don't, and you don't make an impression within those first couple seconds, your chance for it really getting broad appeal is pretty low.
Hey there, it's Brad. As someone who's passionate about podcasting, I've always thought there should be more support for physicians who want to share their stories and expertise. That's why we're launching Doctor Podcast Network.
We're bringing together a community of physician podcasters with one goal in mind: to provide the tools, connections, and resources you need to grow your show. So whether you've been podcasting for a while or maybe you're just starting, we've designed this network to support you every step of the way, and we're going to help each other rise, not compete.
If this sounds like something you'd benefit from, we'd love for you to join us as we get closer to launch. So you can sign up at drpodcastnetwork.co for early access. Stay tuned for more details in the coming weeks. Really looking forward to what we can create together. Doctor Podcast Network, where doctors podcast.
Doctor Podcast Network, where doctors podcast.
Doctor Podcast Network, where doctors podcast.
So I want to get back to communication best practices, because we haven't really covered that yet. And so there's a couple things that I wanted to talk specifically about, right? So balancing humor and creativity while maintaining professionalism, because I've done a couple of interviews using humor medicine, how to use it appropriately. This is my take on it, right? So what's your take on how to balance that humor and creativity while staying professional?
First off, I think that, again, the whole notion of we were going back to the 1950s physician and how things should be, and we're very well-mannered and deeply respected. Look at what's gone on in the changes of TV and all the different forms of media. People, I think, respect authenticity. You can argue about taste and how things have gone, but you are your most effective, right, in communication, I believe, when you're doing 3 things. 1, you're engaging. People want to hear it. 2, in healthcare, you're educating. I'm learning something. 3, you're entertaining them. You're making it fun. The thing that, again, for your audience, in medical school and in residency, it was almost frowned upon if it wasn't a serious, heavily bullet-pointed, over-text slide, PowerPoint that was up there. It reminds me of the Buller, like somebody reading bullet point for bullet point, all the worst communication tactics in the world, but thinking like, this is serious, this is medicine. When, guess where a lot of younger healthcare providers get their information? From health influencers, like other physicians who are doing just what you're doing, who talk real, who can, say bullshit or swear or do whatever and be like a normal human being. It doesn't mean that you don't have something serious to say, but it sure as hell means you're a better communicator than some of the smartest people that may be lecturing, that may have PhDs and an impact factor and tons of papers. But if they're boring as shit, I don't give a crap. We've all been in the back of those lecture halls where you're literally falling asleep, as opposed to a TED Talk. Why does everybody say, oh, a TED Talk? Because those talks are continually refined, and they choose the people that are the best, that have anywhere between 3 to 17 minutes to tell you a story. They use narrative. They're illustrative. They use really good detail. They use hooks. They tell a story that's compelling and can still teach you things along the way. That is not what medical school is. That is not what law school is. That's not what a lot of professional schools are. And I think it's bullshit, because just because it's serious doesn't mean it's the best learning possible. And just because it's funny doesn't mean it's the best learning possible. It has to be really good on all ends.
One, I think you're preaching to the choir, because all my listeners are here because they want to learn how to be better communicators, because we're not taught that in medical school, and we need to be. That needs to be part of the curriculum. You need to be up there on stage giving lecture to classes and classes of medical school because we learned so much crap that we never use, and we'd use this every day. Because the way that you described it, I wasn't sure whether you were talking about using it in the exam room or online, but it would translate perfectly to both.
Either place. I have a slide when I give this talk or one of these talks, and the first thing I do is I click and it says headache. And then I click again and it says diaphoresis. And then I click again and it says palpitations. And I'm looking around to the medical audience and I'm like, you know what this is? I click one more time, it says hypertension. And I said, okay, I know almost everybody in this room, if they're a doctor, has a good sense of what this is. And I click again and it's pheochromocytoma. And I said, that's right. A neuroendocrine tumor with an incidence of 2 to 8 per million that you all know you're going to get on your boards, and you're almost never going to see it unless you're a quaternary center. And guess what? If you miss it nowadays, you have this freaking thing and you can make the diagnosis. Or if you miss it, the person in the ER is going to make the diagnosis. And yet you're not taught the kind of things that you absolutely have to know. Communication, sleep medicine, everybody sleeps. So we taught it? No. But you're going to get asked pheochromocytoma because everybody gets their 2 to 3 board questions. So we haven't revised medical curriculum since the 40s and 50s because everybody gets their slice of flesh, as opposed to how about we ask you questions that are relevant to what you're going to experience in practice.
Let's sit down and talk about what the day of a doctor looks like and figure out what skills you need in order to be the best at that. Let's take it and work it backwards and figure out how to build a medical school from there. But instead, it works like evolution. It's really hard for evolution to get rid of a tail that you don't need anymore, right? It'll stay there in a little limp, but you will not lose that tail unless there's a reason to lose that tail. Whereas everything else gets built on something else, like a wing that used to be a hand. That's how medical school works. You build it on top of something else instead of removing it and replacing it completely. So if anyone here is on a medical school curriculum board, right, we need to start working on that, right? That's how we win the war. We're losing the battles, and this is how we win the war.
And that's medical school, nursing school, pharmacy school. They all have the same examples of just inane curriculum. I remember I was on the curriculum committee of University of Pittsburgh Medical School when we went to problem-based learning. So in my medical school, you didn't see a patient for the first 2 years. You just did 2 more years of college. You did microbiology and you did biochem and all these additional kind of higher level science. And again, I remember the one example everybody uses, the Krebs cycle. I had to remember every step of the Krebs cycle. How's that going for you nowadays? Let alone I was memorizing like what was gram positive, what was coagulase negative. And think how ridiculous that is again now. Right. So problem-based learning was finally a shift in curriculum to say, hey, let's approach things from a cough. What do you need to know about a cough? What systems are involved in a cough? What questions would you ask? But again, when I've asked around for medical schools and residencies and other health profession schools, there are very few that are doing much with communication. Public health does a little better, but very few are learning this mistake, and it's resulted as to where we are today.
Thanks for listening. I have a favor to ask. You listened to the episode until the end, which means you either fell asleep or you really liked the episode. So please share it or like it or comment on a social media post or write us a 5-star review, something. It would really help me out. And maybe what you learned from this episode can help someone else too. The views expressed in this episode are those of the interviewer and interviewee and don't represent the views of their employer or even their significant other. Even though the magic of podcasting make it sound like I'm talking directly to you. This is not a doctor-patient relationship, and this is not medical advice, or financial advice, or really any advice. Thank us again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.